The purple sky stretched over the small human settlement like a blanket made of strange colors that Earth people had never seen before. They came here to this new world called Kepler 442b, and the two suns were setting together, making everything look orange and purple at the same time, which was beautiful, but also reminded everyone that they were very far from home, and that Earth was now just a tiny dot in the sky that nobody could see anymore. Commander Daniel Pierce stood by the big window in the main building and looked out at the view, thinking about how 3 years had passed since the colony ship called Meridian had brought 200 people to this alien planet, and every single day still felt like a strange dream that might end at any moment. But it never did, because this was real and this was now their home, whether they liked it or not. The colony had done well in some ways and struggled in others. Like most things in life tend to go, and the crops grew in the fields, but they needed constant watching and care, because the soil was different and the rain was different, and even the sunlight was different with 2 suns instead of 1, and the machines that cleaned the air hummed all day and all night, making sure everyone could breathe without wearing the heavy masks that they had worn during the first year when everything was new and scary. Children played in the protected areas under the clear domes where they were safe from the strange weather and the things they did not yet understand about this world, and their laughter was the best sound that anyone could hear, because it meant hope, and it meant future, and it meant that maybe humanity could actually survive out here among the stars so far. From the world where they had been born, one of those children was a little girl named Katie Morgan, who was 5 years old and had been born on the long journey between Earth and this new planet, which meant she had never walked on Earth and never seen the blue sky that her parents told her about in bedtime stories, and never felt rain that did not taste slightly metallic and strange. But she did not mind, because this was the only home she had ever known, and she loved it with all her heart. Katie had auburn hair that shined red when the suns hit it just right, and bright eyes that were always looking at everything with curiosity and wonder, like all 5-year-old children do when the world is still new and interesting and not yet boring, the way adults sometimes find it to be when they get older and forget how to see magic in ordinary things. Her most special thing in the whole universe was a small stuffed rabbit that her mother, Dr. Helen Morgan, had made by hand during the long trip through space using old fabric scraps and thread, and a lot of love and patience, because there were no toy stores on a colony ship, and parents had to make do with what they had. And what they had was not much, but it was enough. Katie called the rabbit Mr. Hoppy, and she took him everywhere she went and talked to him like he was real, and could understand her, and maybe in some way he could, because love makes things real in ways that are hard to explain, but easy to feel. And Mr. Hoppy was very real to Katie, even though he was just fabric and stuffing and some buttons for eyes. The humans had known for many months that they were not alone on this planet, because they had seen the natives from far away through cameras and telescopes and drones that flew high above the purple plains and took pictures of everything below. And what they saw were tall, thin people with skin that looked like it was made of mother of pearl, changing colors in the light. The scientists called these native people the Vihari, because that was the sound that seemed to be their name for themselves, or at least that was the best guess that the human scientists could make from listening to the sounds they made when they talked to each other from far away. And the Vihari lived in small groups that moved from place to place across the plains, following the weather and the seasons and the food and the water. They were beautiful, in a way that was completely different from humans, with their tall bodies that moved like grass in wind, and their large eyes that seemed to hold wisdom from thousands of years, and their skin that shimmered with colors that changed based on their feelings or the light or something else that the humans had not figured out yet, because there was still so much to learn. The Vihari had kept their distance from the human settlement, watching from far away, but never coming close, and never trying to talk, and never showing if they were friendly or dangerous, or just curious about these strange loud creatures who had come from the sky in their metal ship and built their metal buildings and wore their strange clothes and made so much noise all the time. Commander Pierce had made very strict rules that everyone had to follow, and the most important rule was that nobody should try to contact the Vihari unless it was absolutely necessary, because they did not want to scare them or make them angry or disturb their way of life, which had been going on for who knows how many thousands of years before humans arrived and started changing things just by being there. Dr. Susan Clark was in charge of the team that studied the Vihari from far away, using cameras and computers and lots of patience. And she spent her days watching them and taking notes and trying to understand their culture and their language and their way of life, without ever actually talking to them. Which was hard because the best way to learn about people is usually to just ask them questions, but that was not allowed yet. The survival of the colony depended on not making the natives angry or scared, because if the Vihari decided they did not want the humans here, then the humans would have to leave or fight, and neither option was good because leaving meant going back into space with nowhere to go and not enough fuel to reach another planet. And fighting meant probably losing because the humans did not know anything about the Vihari or what they could do or how many of them there were. So the rule was simple and clear and everyone understood it. Even the children who were taught from the first day they could understand words that the Vihari were to be left alone and observed from far away and never approached and never bothered, and this rule had worked well for 3 years, keeping the peace and keeping everyone safe. But children are children no matter what planet they live on and no matter how many rules the adults make, and sometimes children do things that adults would never do because children have not yet learned to be afraid of the unknown and have not yet learned that different means dangerous and have not yet built the walls in their minds that adults build to keep themselves feeling safe. And sometimes those childish actions that break all the rules turn out to be exactly what was needed all along, even though nobody knew it at the time, and even though it scared the adults half to death when they found out what had happened, and this was one of those times that would change everything forever. It happened on a warm afternoon when both suns were high up in the purple sky, and the temperature was just right for playing outside, and Katie had been playing near the eastern edge of the settlement where the invisible energy wall met a small group of trees that the colonists called whispering trees, because their leaves made soft musical sounds when the wind blew through them. Katie was bouncing her favorite ball against the ground and catching it and counting how many times she could do it without missing, and she had just reached 15, which was her new record, when the ball bounced wrong and went rolling away from her toward the energy barrier, and then right through the small gap where the machine that made the barrier was broken and waiting to be fixed. She knew she was not supposed to go outside the barrier because that was one of the big rules that all the children had to follow, and her mother had explained it many times, that outside was not safe and that she should always stay where the adults could see her and where the barrier could protect her from anything dangerous that might be out there in the wild parts of the planet. But the ball was right there just a few steps away, and she could see it sitting on the purple grass, and it would only take a second to grab it and come back. And nobody was watching her right now because the adults were all busy doing their adult things and talking their adult talk and not paying attention to one small girl and her ball. So Katie did what 5-year-old children have done since the beginning of time when they see something they want and think nobody will notice. And she squeezed through the narrow gap in the barrier and walked the 3 meters to where her ball had stopped rolling and picked it up, feeling very clever for getting it back so easily. And that was when she saw her sitting under one of the whispering trees, looking small and sad and scared in a way that Katie recognized, even though she had never seen one of the Vihari people up close before. And even though this person looked completely different from any human Katie had ever met. It was a young Vihari girl who looked maybe a little older than Katie. But it was hard to tell because alien children might age differently than human children. And the scientists were still trying to figure that out, along with everything else they were trying to figure out about the Vihari people and their culture. The Vihari girl was curled up with her knees pulled to her chest and her long arms wrapped around her legs, and her head was down, and her shoulders were shaking in that way that means someone is crying, even if you cannot hear the sound, and even if they are trying to hide it. Her skin, which should have been shimmering with pretty colors like oil on water or like the inside of a seashell, was instead looking dull and gray, like all the color had been drained out of it, and Katie somehow knew without anyone telling her that this meant the girl was very upset or very sick or very scared, or maybe all 3 at once. The Vihari girl had her large eyes squeezed shut tight, and she was making soft sounds that were not words, but were clearly the sounds of someone who was hurting inside, and Katie stood there holding her ball and watching and feeling her own heart hurt, because she knew what it felt like to be sad and alone, even though she had never been really alone because there were always people around. In the colony, Katie had been told that the Vihari were aliens and that they were different and that they might be dangerous and that children should never go near them. But standing there looking at this crying girl under the tree, Katie did not see an alien or a danger or anything scary at all, and instead she saw exactly what she was, which was another child who needed help. Without thinking about rules or barriers or what her mother would say, or what Commander Pierce would say, or what anyone would say, Katie walked slowly over to the whispering tree and sat down on the purple grass next to the Vihari girl, being careful not to touch her, because she did not know if touching was okay in Vihari culture, or if it might scare her. Even more, for a long moment nothing happened, and Katie just sat there, and the Vihari girl kept crying, and the wind made the tree leaves whisper their soft songs, and the two suns kept shining down warm and bright, and somewhere far away, Katie could hear the sounds of the colony, but they seemed very distant and not important right now. Then Katie remembered Mr. Hoppy, who was tucked under her arm where he always was when she went outside to play, and she looked at the little stuffed rabbit, with his button eyes and his soft fabric ears and his little smile that her mother had stitched on with such care, and she thought about how Mr. Hoppy always made her feel better when she was sad. She held Mr. Hoppy out toward the Vihari girl, moving slowly so she would not startle her and trying to make it clear that she was offering a gift. Not a threat, even though she did not know if the Vihari understood gifts or understood stuffed animals or understood anything about human children and their toys. The Vihari girl must have felt the movement or maybe heard the soft rustle of fabric, because she opened her eyes and looked, and her eyes were like pools of liquid gold, and they were the most beautiful and the saddest eyes that Katie had ever seen. And they looked at Mr. Hoppy with something that might have been curiosity or confusion, or maybe even hope. Katie pushed Mr. Hoppy gently into the Vihari girl's hands, which were longer than human hands, and had 6 fingers instead of 5, but were still clearly hands that could hold things and touch things and feel things just like Katie's hands could. And the Vihari girl took the stuffed rabbit carefully, as if it might break or disappear. "It is okay," Katie whispered, even though she did not know if the Vihari girl could understand English or any human language at all. But sometimes the words do not matter as much as the tone and the feeling behind them. And Katie tried to put all her kindness and all her caring into those simple words, hoping they would somehow translate across the space between species. "Mr. Hoppy makes me feel better when I am sad." Katie continued, talking softly, like she was talking to a scared animal that might run away if she was too loud or too sudden. "And you can hold him for as long as you want, and he will help you feel better too, because that is what he does, and he is very good at it." The Vihari girl looked at Mr. Hoppy, and then at Katie, and then back at Mr. Hoppy, and slowly, very slowly, her skin began to change from that dull gray color to something a little brighter, and a few small sparkles of color began to show through, like stars coming out at night. And Katie smiled, because she thought maybe that meant the girl was feeling a little bit better. The two children sat there together under the whispering tree, with Mr. Hoppy held carefully in the Vihari girl's 6-fingered hands, and neither of them knew that far away in the colony, human adults were starting to panic because Katie was missing, and neither of them knew that this simple moment of one child helping another child was about to change the future of 2 entire species forever. Dr. Helen Morgan felt her heart stop for a terrible moment when she turned around and realized that Katie was not where she had been just a few minutes ago, and the playground that had seemed so safe and so small suddenly looked huge and full of 1,000 places where a little girl could be hiding or hurt or lost. She had only looked away for a moment to talk with another parent about something that seemed important at the time, but now seemed completely meaningless, because nothing was more important than knowing where your child was. And Katie had been right there playing with her ball and counting out loud. And then Helen had turned to answer a question, and when she turned back, Katie was gone. Helen called Katie's name once, and then louder, and then she was running and calling, and other parents were looking up from what they were doing and joining in the search, and within minutes the alarm had been raised, and Commander Pierce had been notified, and security teams were mobilizing, and everyone was looking for one small girl with auburn hair and a stuffed rabbit. The search spread out from the playground in circles like ripples in water, and people checked every building and every dome and every corner where a child might go, and Helen kept calling Katie's name over and over, even though her voice was getting hoarse and her throat was hurting, because she could not stop and would not stop until her daughter was found. Dr. Susan Clark had been in her office looking at data on her computer screens showing patterns of Vihari movement across the plains when she heard the alarm, and she grabbed her binoculars and ran outside. because more eyes searching was always better, and she knew every parent's nightmare was losing a child in a place that was still so new and so unknown. She scanned the area around the colony looking for any sign of Katie, and that was when she saw movement near the whispering trees beyond the eastern barrier, and she focused. Her binoculars and what she saw made her blood turn cold and then strangely warm all at the same time, because it was both her worst fear and her greatest hope combined into one impossible moment. "Commander Katie," she said quietly, and Commander Pierce was beside her in an instant, and she handed him the binoculars without saying anything else because some things needed to be seen to be believed, and this was definitely one of those things that words could not properly describe. Daniel Pierce looked through the binoculars and saw what Susan had seen, and he felt every muscle in his body tense up because there, sitting under the whispering tree beyond their protective barrier, was Katie Morgan, and next to her was a young Vihari, and they were playing together like this was the most normal thing in the world. The two children were passing Mr. Hoppy back and forth, and Katie was showing the Vihari girl how to make the rabbit hop across the purple grass, and the Vihari girl was trying to copy her movements, and both of them seemed completely unaware that they had just broken the most important rule that the colony had, and that dozens of armed humans were watching them with a mixture of terror and wonder. "Nobody move," Pierce ordered, and his voice had that tone that meant this was not a suggestion but a command that everyone had better follow. "And Dr. Clark, get your team here now, and bring all your equipment, because we need to observe this carefully and document everything that happens." Helen Morgan had heard the commotion and came running, and when she saw Katie through the binoculars, she made a sound that was half sob and half gasp, and she started to run toward her daughter because every instinct in her body was screaming to get Katie away from the alien and back to safety where she belonged. But Pierce caught her arm gently but firmly and said, "Wait. Helen, just wait and look at what is happening here, because this might be the most important moment in the history of our colony, and we cannot rush in and ruin it, no matter how much we want to protect our children." Helen wanted to argue and fight and pull away and run to Katie because that was her baby out there with an alien that they knew nothing about, and anything could happen and Katie could be in danger. But she also saw what Pierce saw, which was two children playing together with no fear and no hate and no walls between them. The Vihari girl's skin was shimmering now with soft blues and greens and purples like the northern lights that some of the older colonists remembered from Earth, and it was clear that she was happy, or at least happier than she had been before, and Katie was teaching her a clapping game that human children had played for hundreds of years. Dr. Clark was setting up cameras and recording devices and taking notes as fast as she could write, and she was whispering into her recorder about first contact and cultural exchange and the breakthrough that everyone had been hoping for but never expected would come from two children who did not know enough to be afraid of each other. The watching humans saw Katie pick up her ball and bounce it, and the Vihari girl watched with those large golden eyes, full of curiosity, and Katie rolled the ball to her, and the Vihari girl caught it and examined it carefully, turning it over in her six-fingered hands like it was the most fascinating thing she had ever seen. Then the Vihari girl did something that made everyone watching hold their breath, and she held up her hands and light began to form between them, like she was creating patterns out of pure energy, and the patterns moved and danced and formed shapes that looked like flowers and birds and other things that Katie clearly found amazing because she clapped her hands and laughed with pure delight. This was Vihari ability that the scientists had theorized about but never seen up close, and here this young girl was showing it to Katie, like it was a party trick or a game, and Katie was responding with wonder instead of fear. And the cultural exchange was happening naturally between two children who had no idea they were making history. For almost an hour the humans watched and recorded and took notes while the two children played together under the whispering tree, and it was peaceful and beautiful and everything that first contact should be, but so rarely is when adults are in charge of making it happen. Then something changed, and the Vihari girl suddenly stood up quickly, and her skin flickered with colors that might have meant alarm or fear, and she was looking toward the plains beyond the trees, and Katie stood up too, following the girl's gaze. And that was when the humans saw what the Vihari girl had sensed before they could see it. There on the horizon, moving toward the whispering trees, were 7 tall figures, and even from this distance it was clear they were adult Vihari, and they were coming fast, and everyone who was watching felt their hearts start to pound because this was the moment that would determine everything. The security team had their weapons ready, but Commander Pierce had given very clear orders that nobody was to fire unless he gave the direct command, and everyone was to stay calm and keep their fingers off the triggers, because one wrong move could start a war that humanity could not win and would destroy everything they had built here. The 7 Vihari were moving with purpose across the purple plains, and their movements were smooth and deliberate like water flowing downhill, and it was clear they knew exactly where they were going and why, and that made everyone watching feel both better and worse at the same time, because purpose could mean many things, both good and bad. Dr. Clark was studying them through her equipment, and taking readings and measurements and trying to learn everything she could in the few minutes before they arrived, and she whispered to Pierce that these were elders based on the patterns on their skin which showed age and status in Vihari society according to her research. The young Vihari girl saw the approaching adults and her skin flickered with many colors at once like she was feeling many emotions all together, and she quickly handed Mr. Hoppy back to Katie and made gestures, with her hands that seemed urgent and important, even though Katie could not understand what they meant. Katie took Mr. Hoppy back and held him close, and she nodded at the Vihari girl, even though she had no idea what she was agreeing to, and sometimes that is what friendship is about, which is being there for someone even when you do not fully understand what is happening. But you know, they need your support. The elders reached the whispering trees moving as a group, like they were one being with 7 bodies and the tallest one whose skin shimmered with deep purples and silvers that looked like twilight sky, moved forward and knelt down beside the young girl who must have been related to him in some way that the humans did not yet understand. This elder ran his long, delicate fingers over the young girl's face and arms, checking her carefully like a human parent would check a child who had been lost, and the tenderness in his movements was universal and needed no translation, because every parent in the watching crowd recognized it instantly as love and relief and concern, all mixed together. Then those ancient golden eyes turned to look at Katie, and the elder studied her with an intensity that made Helen Morgan's heart clench with fear. But Katie just stood there holding Mr. Hoppy and looking back at the elder with the same curious, open expression that she looked at everything. Because fear was something she had not yet learned, and innocence was her greatest protection. Helen could not help herself anymore, and she pulled away from Pierce's grip and ran toward her daughter, calling Katie's name, and the security team tensed up, and Pierce swore under his breath, but did not stop her because he understood that some instincts were too strong to fight against, and a mother's need to protect her child was the strongest instinct there was. The elder Vihari stood up slowly to his full height, which was much taller than any human, and he positioned himself between Helen and the 2 children. And it was not a threatening gesture exactly, but it was clearly protective, and it said without words that he would keep these children safe, no matter what happened next. Helen stopped running when she was about 3 meters away, and she held up her hands to show they were empty and that she meant no harm, and her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. But she kept her hands steady and her face as calm as she could make it, even though inside she was screaming or die. A long moment that felt like hours. The adult human and the elder Vihari just looked at each other, and Helen looked into those golden eyes and saw intelligence and wisdom and something else that might have been understanding or might have been judgment, and she tried to communicate with her eyes and her expression that she was just a mother who loved her child. Then the elder did something completely unexpected, and he knelt down again, bringing himself to Helen's eye level, and he gestured for her to do the same. And Helen did not hesitate because she would do anything if it meant keeping Katie safe, and she knelt on the purple grass and waited to see what would happen next. The elder pointed to the young Vihari girl and then made a gesture that took in both Katie and Mr. Hoppy, and then he placed his long-fingered hand over his chest where a human heart would be, and then extended that hand toward Helen in a gesture that was so clearly meaningful that even without sharing a language Helen understood. "Thank you," the gesture said as clearly as if the elder had spoken perfect English, "and your child helped my child, and I am grateful." And Helen felt tears spring to her eyes because she had been so afraid and so sure that something terrible was going to happen, and instead here was this being from another world, thanking her. Helen nodded and put her own hand over her heart and then extended it toward the elder, copying his gesture and trying to communicate back that she understood and that she was sorry if Katie had caused any problems, but also that she was proud of her daughter for being kind, even when she should not have been there at all. The other 6 elders had been standing back watching, but now they came forward slowly and carefully, keeping their movements non-threatening, and they formed a loose circle around the humans and the children. And Helen felt her fear spike again, but she held still and kept breathing, and trusted that if they wanted to hurt her, they would have done it already. Commander Pierce and Dr. Clark had moved closer too, bringing the security team and the scientific equipment, and what had started as a tense standoff was slowly transforming into something else that nobody had quite expected, but that everyone recognized as the beginning of something important and possibly wonderful. The young Vihari girl who was sitting between Katie and the elders started making gestures and sounds trying to tell her story, and the elders listened carefully. And Katie chimed in with her own version in English. And even though nobody could understand anyone else's words, the meaning was becoming clear through actions and expressions and the universal language of body, movement. Dr. Clark was recording everything and whispering translations and interpretations as best she could, based on her months of studying the Vihari from far away, and she pieced together that the young girl whose name sounded something like Lyra had wandered away from her family group and gotten lost near the whispering trees, which were apparently dangerous for young Vihari, for reasons the humans did not understand yet. Lyra had been terrified and alone and crying when Katie found her, and Katie had given her Mr. Hoppy and sat with her and played with her until the elders arrived. And this simple act of kindness from a human child to a Vihari child had changed everything, because it showed the Vihari that humans were not just strange, loud aliens, but beings capable of compassion and care. The tallest elder, whom Pierce would later call Silverlight, because of his coloring, reached into a pouch he wore at his side and pulled out something small that glowed with soft light, and he offered it to Katie with both hands, holding it out in a gesture that conveyed deep respect, even though the humans did not know yet that this was one of the highest honors in Vihari culture. Katie took the glowing stone carefully with both hands, copying the elder's gesture, without knowing why, but sensing somehow that this was important, and the stone was warm in her palms and pulsed with a gentle light that seemed to beat in time with her heart. And it was the most beautiful thing she had ever held besides Mr. Hoppy. She looked at the stone and then at Mr. Hoppy, and then at Lyra, who was watching her with those big golden eyes that still had traces of sadness in them, even though she was much happier now than she had been when Katie first found her. And Katie made a decision that 5-year-olds make sometimes, without thinking about consequences or value or any of the practical things that adults worry about. She held out Mr. Hoppy to Lyra with both hands, just like Silverlight had held out the stone, and she said, "You can keep him," in that solemn voice that children use when they are doing something they think is very grown up and important, and for when you are scared, because he helps with that and he is very good at making people feel better. Helen started to protest because that rabbit was irreplaceable, and it had been made with love during the long journey between stars when resources were scarce and every scrap of fabric mattered, and Mr. Hoppy represented hours of careful work, and so many memories of Katie as a baby and as a toddler and growing up. But Helen stopped herself before the words came out, because she saw Lyra clutch Mr. Hoppy to her chest and saw the way her skin shimmered with colors that could only mean joy. And she understood that some things mattered more than objects, even precious objects, and that her daughter had just done something far more valuable than keeping a toy. The elders made sounds among themselves that were like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, and they seemed to be discussing what had just happened, and their skin colors shifted and changed as they talked, and Dr. Clark was frantically taking notes, trying to match the colors with emotions and meaning, but it was like trying to learn a whole language in a few minutes. Then Silverlight turned back to the humans, and he bowed deeply from the waist in a gesture that needed no translation, because respect looks the same across species, and the other 6 elders did the same, all bowing to Katie and to Helen and to the other humans who had gathered. And it was one of those moments that everyone knew they would remember for the rest of their lives. And then the elders did something that would change everything and change it forever, and change it in ways that nobody watching could have predicted, even though they all hoped it would be good, because the alternative was too terrible to think about. and they had come so far and worked so hard to build a life here. Silverlight made a gesture that seemed to mean wait or stay, and then he and the other elders moved a short distance away and had what was clearly an important discussion. With much gesture and color change and sounds that ranged from soft to urgent and back to soft again, and the humans waited, not knowing what else to do. Katie sat back down next to Lyra, and the two children went back to playing as if nothing unusual was happening. Because to them, nothing unusual was happening, because they were just two kids who had found a friend, and adults were always doing incomprehensible adult things that children learned to ignore. After what felt like a very long time, but was probably only a few minutes, the elders came back and Silverlight approached Commander Pierce directly, and Pierce stood very still, trying to look calm and authoritative, even though his heart was racing, because this was first contact and he had never been trained for this, and nobody had, because humanity had never met another intelligent species before. Silverlight began to make gestures and sounds, and at first Pierce did not understand any of it, but then the elder started using his hands to draw in the air and point at things, and slowly, with Dr. Clark's help, they began to piece together what he was trying to communicate, and it was an invitation. The Vihari were inviting the humans to come to their camp and to meet the rest of their people, and to begin what the gestures seemed to indicate was a sharing of knowledge and resources and space on this world that both species now called home, and it was more than the humans had dared to hope for in their wildest dreams. Pierce looked at Dr. Clark, and then at Helen, and then at Katie, who was still playing with Lyra, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just accomplished what diplomats and politicians and trained negotiators had failed to do on Earth for thousands of years, which was to bridge the gap between different peoples through simple kindness. Yes, Pierce said, and then he tried to make the same kind of gestures back, pointing to the colony, and then to the Vihari camp, and making movements that he hoped conveyed agreement and friendship and peaceful intentions, and judging by the way Silverlight's skin brightened with warm colors, he must have gotten at least part of the message across. Over the next 3 days, the humans prepared for the visit to the Vihari camp, and Dr. Clark worked day and night to create a basic system of communication using gestures and drawings and the few words that both species had managed to teach each other in their brief interactions, and it was crude, but it was a start. A delegation was chosen carefully to represent the colony, and it included Pierce as leader, and Clark as cultural expert, and Helen because she was Katie's mother, and Katie because the Vihari had specifically requested her presence through gestures that made it clear she was honored among them for what she had done. They brought gifts of their own because every culture understands gift-giving, even if the specific customs vary, and they chose things that seemed universal, like food from their gardens and samples of fabric and tools they had made, and pictures of Earth so the Vihari could see where humans came from. When the day came, Katie wore the glowing stone on a cord around her neck that one of the engineers had made for her, and she held her mother's hand as they walked out beyond the barrier toward the Vihari camp that had been set up within sight of the colony, and the whole settlement watched them go with hope and fear mixed together. Vihari camp was beautiful in a way that human camps never were, because the Vihari did not build solid structures, but instead created spaces using living plants that they somehow shaped and grew into shelters and gathering places, and it all looked like it had been there forever, even though the humans knew it had been built in just a few days. Silverlight greeted them, and Lyra was there too, still holding Mr. Hoppy, and she ran to Katie, and the two girls hugged like old friends, even though they had only met once, and Katie showed Lyra the glowing stone, and Lyra touched it gently, and her skin rippled with happy colors. What followed was hours of careful communication, as the Vihari began to teach the humans about their world, and the humans began to explain about themselves and their needs and their hopes for the future. And it was slow and frustrating at times, but it was also wonderful, because both species were trying so hard to understand each other. The Vihari showed them plants that were safe to eat and plants that were deadly poison, and they showed them where to find water that was clean and good, and where the dangerous animals lived, and when the big storms came, and all the information that the humans would have taken years to learn through dangerous trial and error. And more than just information, they offered something that the colonists had desperately needed since they arrived, which was acceptance and belonging, and the feeling that this world could truly be their home because the people who had lived here first were willing to share it with them. The visits between humans and Vihari became regular events over the following weeks, and both groups began to learn each other's ways, and Dr. Clark made huge progress in understanding the Vihari language, which was partly spoken words and partly colors that showed on their skin and partly gestures that all had to be interpreted together to get the full meaning. Several of the elders showed a surprising talent for learning human speech, and within a month, simple conversations were possible, even if they were slow and full of misunderstandings that had to be cleared up through patience and repetition, and sometimes drawing pictures in the dirt until both sides understood what the other was trying to say. The humans learned that the Vihari had been watching them since the day the colony ship landed, and they had been curious but also cautious because the humans seemed so strange with their loud machines and their need to change everything around them and their inability to understand the natural rhythms of the planet. The Vihari had not known what to make of these aliens who wore artificial skins to protect themselves from the air, and who brought their own food instead of eating what the planet provided, and who built walls and barriers instead of living in harmony with the land the way the Vihari had done for thousands of years. But Katie's simple act of sharing Mr. Hoppy with Lyra had changed all of that, because in Vihari culture, the most important value was the protection and care of children, and when they saw a human child treat a Vihari child with such gentleness and generosity without expecting anything in return, it told them everything they needed to know about what kind of people humans really were. Silverlight told this to Commander Pierce through Dr. Clark's translation, and his words were slow and careful, but their meaning was clear, and he said, "Your small one showed us your heart through her actions, and this matters more than all the words we could speak, and now we know you are good people who deserve to share this world with us." The sharing of knowledge went both ways, because the humans had things to teach as well, and they showed the Vihari their medicine, which could heal some illnesses that the Vihari suffered from, and they taught them about human mathematics and astronomy, which fascinated the elders who spent hours looking at star charts and learning about Earth and where it was in the great darkness of space. The Vihari helped the humans understand how to farm better by working with the planet's natural cycles instead of fighting against them, and crop yields doubled within weeks of following the Vihari advice. And suddenly food was not the constant worry it had been since the colony began. They taught the humans how to weave fibers from native plants to create fabric that was stronger and more comfortable than the synthetic materials the colonists had been using. And soon, people were wearing clothes that looked like a blend of human and Vihari styles. And feeling better for it, Dr. Clark established a formal cultural exchange program where humans and Vihari could meet regularly to share skills and stories and knowledge, and the barrier between the settlement and the Vihari camps began to blur as members of both species crossed back and forth, freely learning to trust and even to love each other. Katie and Lyra became best friends in the way that children do when they find someone who understands them, and they spent almost every day together teaching each other their languages and inventing games that combined human and Vihari traditions, and generally being proof that friendship needs no translation. Mr. Hoppy traveled back and forth between the colony and the Vihari camp, because sometimes Katie wanted him, and sometimes Lyra needed him, and they shared him the way they shared everything else, with the easy generosity that children have before adults. Teach them about ownership and property and mine versus yours. Helen Morgan watched her daughter grow up in a world where humans and Vihari were simply neighbors and friends, and she thought about Earth, where humanity had failed so many times to bridge differences even among their own kind, and yet, here millions of light years from home, her child was showing them all a better way. Commander Pierce filed regular reports back to Earth, though the messages took years to travel the distance, and even longer to get replies, but he documented everything that happened, and he knew that future colonies would learn from what New Haven was accomplishing here. He wrote about the first trade agreement where humans provided medical supplies and the Vihari provided knowledge about surviving the great storms, and he wrote about the joint weather warning system they developed, where Vihari who could sense changes in the atmosphere would alert the humans to danger. He wrote about the festivals they began to celebrate together, where human music and Vihari light displays combined into something entirely new and beautiful. And he wrote about the children of both species playing together and learning together and showing their parents how pointless the old fears had been. But his most important report was perhaps his simplest, and he wrote that first contact had been achieved not by trained diplomats or armed soldiers, but by a 5-year-old girl with a stuffed rabbit who saw not an alien but a child who needed comfort, and that perhaps this was what humanity needed to remember. He wrote that kindness was truly a universal language, and that compassion required no translation, and that in the end what mattered most was not how different we were, but how similar our hearts could be when we chose to see each other as people rather than as others. The colony thrived in ways nobody had expected when they first arrived, and it was not just because of the practical help the Vihari provided, though that was certainly important, but also because having friends and allies on this world made it feel less lonely and less scary, and more like home children who had been born on the journey, or born after landing, grew up, knowing both human and Vihari ways, and they became interpreters not just of language but of culture and understanding. And they would be the bridge that carried both species into a shared future. Katie wore the glowing stone every day, and it became as much a part of her as Mr. Hoppy had been, and whenever she touched it, she thought about Lyra, and about the day they met, and about how scared Lyra had been, and how a simple act of sharing had changed so much. She did not know, and could not, know that her story would be told for generations to come on both Earth and Kepler 442b, and that she would become a symbol of what was best about humanity, which was not their technology or their strength, but their capacity to care for someone else's pain, even when that someone was completely different from them. The seasons changed on Kepler 442b, and the great storms came and went, and the two suns rose and set in their eternal dance, and through it all, the colony and the Vihari lived and worked together, building something new that was neither purely human nor purely Vihari, but something better than either could have created alone. 10 years passed like water flowing through fingers, and those years brought changes that the first colonists could hardly have imagined when they stepped off the meridian onto this alien soil and looked up at a purple sky that seemed to promise both wonder and danger in equal measure. New Haven had grown from a small collection of protective domes and prefabricated buildings into a real city that spread across the plains in a pattern that was part human grid and part Vihari flowing curves, and the architecture reflected both cultures with human technology, supporting structures made from living plants shaped by Vihari knowledge. The population had expanded to nearly 1,000 souls, and that number included not just humans who had arrived on new colony ships, but also Vihari, who had chosen to make their homes among the humans because they liked the way humans thought and talked and created things that the Vihari had never imagined. Mixed neighborhoods were common now, and it was normal to see Vihari children and human children playing together in the streets and parks and schools that had been designed to meet the needs of both species, with spaces that were sometimes roofed and sometimes open to the sky, and always full of the sound of laughter. Katie Morgan was 15 years old now, and she had grown tall and graceful, though she still had the same auburn hair and the same bright, curious eyes that had seen past the surface of things to the heart underneath. Even when she was just 5 years old and meeting an alien for the first time, she served as a junior ambassador, which was a formal title that meant she helped facilitate communication between humans and Vihari, and she was good at it because she had grown up with a foot in both worlds and could understand the way each species thought and felt and expressed themselves. Lyra had grown too, and her skin now showed the deeper colors and more complex patterns that meant she was approaching adulthood in Vihari society. And she worked alongside Katie as an ambassador because the friendship they had formed as children had deepened into a partnership that served both their peoples, together with other children of both species who had grown up in this mixed world. They represented a generation that saw no barriers and no impossible differences, and they spoke both languages fluently and understood both cultures deeply, and they dreamed of a future where the distinction between human and Vihari mattered less than the content of someone's character. The glowing stone that Silverlight had given Katie on that first day hung in the New Haven Museum of First Contact in a place of honor behind protective glass, and next to it sat Mr. Hoppy, who had been carefully restored by Vihari craftspeople, using techniques that preserved old fabric better than any human method could. The Vihari had made Mr. Hoppy sacred in their culture because he represented the kindness that had bridged the gap between worlds, and children of both species visited the museum to see him and to hear the story of how one small girl with a pure heart had done what armies and politicians could never have accomplished. Silverlight had passed away the previous year at an age that was considered very old for Vihari, and his passing had been mourned by both humans and Vihari because he had been a leader who chose wisdom over fear and peace over conflict, and his choice had made everything else possible. His final words had been translated by Dr. Clark, who was now the head of interspecies relations and had devoted her life to building bridges between the two cultures, and she said he spoke about the small one who had taught everyone that in kindness there is no alien, and in compassion we are all one family under the stars. More colony ships had arrived from Earth, bringing new settlers who were amazed to find humans and aliens living together in harmony, and each new arrival was taught the story of Katie and Lyra as part of their orientation, because it explained how this miracle had come to be and what values they needed to uphold to maintain it. The story had become legend, and like all legends, it had grown a bit in the telling, but the core truth remained, which was that a child had seen another child in pain and had responded with kindness, and that simple act had changed the course of history for two entire species. Every year on the anniversary of that first meeting, the entire city celebrated the Festival of the Rabbit, which was a holiday unique to Kepler 442b, and during the festival, children of both species exchanged handmade toys, and the adults spent the day performing acts of kindness and service for each other. It was a reminder that the greatest human quality had proven to be not their intelligence or their technology, or their ability to travel between stars, but something far simpler and far more profound, which was their capacity to care about someone else's suffering, even when that someone looked completely different from them. Dr. Helen Morgan now ran the Interspecies Medical Program, where human and Vihari doctors worked together to treat patients of both species, and she had learned so much about Vihari biology and medicine over the years, while teaching them about human anatomy and healing practices, and the exchange had saved countless lives. She often thought about that day when her heart had nearly stopped with fear for Katie and how she had been so afraid of the unknown and the alien and the other. But Katie had not been afraid because children have not yet learned to fear what is different. And sometimes that ignorance of fear is the greatest wisdom of all. Commander Pierce had retired from active duty, but he served as the colony's official historian, and he spent his days writing the Chronicle of New Haven, recording everything that had happened from the first landing to the present day, so that future generations would know how hard people had worked and how lucky they had been. He wrote about the mistakes and the triumphs and the fears and the hopes, and he wrote about the day-to-day reality of building a new civilization on an alien world. But he always came back to that one moment under the whispering tree because it had been the turning point that made everything else possible. In his latest entry, he reflected on what it meant to be human and what humanity had learned from traveling to the stars, and he wrote that they had discovered something important, which was that the best parts of being human were not unique to humans at all, but were universal values that any intelligent species could understand and share. He wrote that the Vihari valued compassion and kindness and the protection of children just as humans did, and that they honored courage and wisdom and generosity in the same way that humans honored these qualities, and that maybe these values were not cultural, but something deeper and more fundamental. Maybe he wrote these values were written into the fabric of consciousness itself, and any being that could think and feel and care would recognize them as good and true and worth striving for, and if that was the case, then humanity was not alone in the universe in any way that mattered. The story of New Haven and the friendship between Katie and Lyra had reached Earth by now, and it had given hope to billions of people who looked up at the stars and wondered if humanity would ever find friends out there among the endless dark. And now they knew the answer was yes. 20 years after that first meeting under the whispering tree, Katie Morgan stood before the Interstellar Council representing both humanity and the Vihari in a growing alliance of species that had begun to form as more and more civilizations made contact with each other across the galaxy. She wore formal clothing that combined human and Vihari styles, and around her neck hung the glowing stone that Silverlight had given her so long ago, along with other gifts from other worlds she had visited as an ambassador, and each one represented a friendship formed and a bridge built between different peoples. At her side stood Lyra, whose skin now showed the deep, complex patterns of a fully mature Vihari adult, and whose wisdom was respected by both their peoples, and together they had traveled far from Kepler 442b to help other species learn what they had learned about peaceful contact and mutual respect. They had become advocates for peaceful first contact protocols, teaching other civilizations the lessons that New Haven had learned through trial and error, and sometimes through mistakes, but always through a commitment to seeing the other as a person rather than as a threat or a resource to be exploited. Their message was simple but powerful, and it was this: that every species should approach contact with kindness rather than fear, and should listen with compassion rather than judgment, and should remember that before we are human or Vihari or any other species, we are all beings capable of suffering and joy and love. Some species found this message easy to accept because their cultures already valued these things, and some found it harder because they had histories of conflict and conquest. But Katie and Lyra persisted because they had seen firsthand how much difference one act of kindness could make. Back on Kepler 442b in the museum that had been built to honor the friendship between their worlds, Mr. Hoppy still sat in his place of honor behind protective glass, and every day children of many different species came to see him and to hear the story that had become known across multiple star systems. The story was told in many languages now, and with slight variations depending on who was telling it. But the core remained the same, which was that a human child had shared her most precious possession with an alien child in distress, and that simple act of generosity had changed the course of galactic history. Some species had created their own versions of the Festival of the Rabbit, adapting it to their own cultures and customs, but keeping the essential meaning, which was a day devoted to kindness and gift-giving, and remembering that what unites all intelligent beings is greater than what divides them. New Haven had grown into a major city now with a population of over 10,000 that included not just humans and Vihari, but also members of 3 other species who had come to see this legendary place where the first peaceful contact between different intelligent species had occurred, and many had chosen to stay. The city had become a center for interspecies cooperation and learning, with universities and research centers where beings from different worlds worked together to solve problems and share knowledge and create art and music that blended multiple cultural traditions into something entirely new. Helen Morgan had retired from active medical practice, but she taught at the university, training new generations of doctors in both human and alien medicine, and she watched with pride as her daughter helped shape the future of multiple civilizations, and she thought about how far they had all come from that scary day when Katie had disappeared beyond the barrier. Commander Pierce had passed away 5 years earlier at a good old age, and his funeral had been attended by thousands of beings from multiple worlds, and his Chronicle of New Haven had become required reading for anyone studying interspecies relations, and his words continued to inspire long after he was gone. In one of his final entries, he had written about the nature of discovery and what humanity had really found when they traveled to the stars, and he said that the greatest discovery was not a new planet or new resources or even new friends, though all of those were valuable. The greatest discovery, he wrote, was the confirmation that the best parts of being human, which were the capacity for kindness and compassion and empathy, were not human traits at all, but universal values that any thinking, feeling being could understand and share, and that this was perhaps the most hopeful thing humanity had ever learned, because it meant that wherever humans went in the galaxy, they would find not aliens in the sense of beings completely foreign and incomprehensible, but rather neighbors who might look different and speak different and have different customs, but who shared the same fundamental values and the same basic desire for peace and prosperity and safety for their children. Katie often thought about that day under the whispering tree when she had been 5 years old and had seen a crying girl and had given her Mr. Hoppy without thinking about the consequences or what it might mean for the future. And she realized now that she had not been trying to make history or change the world. She had simply seen someone who was sad and had wanted to make them feel better, and that impulse, which was so simple and so natural, had turned out to be the key to everything, because it came from a place of pure compassion, untainted by fear or calculation or any thought of personal gain. As she addressed the Interstellar Council, talking about new protocols for peaceful contact and ways to prevent misunderstandings between species, She thought about how all of this had grown from one moment of childish kindness, and she felt humbled and grateful and determined to keep spreading that message to every corner of the galaxy. Because in the end, what the universe needed was not more weapons or more barriers or more fear, but simply more people of all species who were willing to see past differences and to respond to suffering with compassion, and to remember that we are all fellow travelers on the same cosmic journey. The story of the 5-year-old who shared a toy with a sad native girl had become more than just history, and it had become a symbol and a reminder and a guiding light for multiple civilizations. And every time someone heard it, they were reminded of what truly mattered, which was not power or conquest, but simple human kindness that turned out to be not human at all, but universal. And what the elders did next, after receiving that gift of kindness from a human child, was to open their hearts and their world to the strangers who had come from the sky. And in doing so, they had shown that generosity breeds. Generosity and kindness creates kindness, and that the best way to make friends across the stars is to simply be the kind of person worth being friends with. As the twin suns set over New Haven, painting the purple sky in shades of orange and gold, children of 5 different species played together in the parks and streets, and their laughter rose up to the stars like a promise of the future. And somewhere in the museum, Mr. Hoppy sat in his glass case, reminding everyone who saw him that the smallest acts of kindness can change entire worlds.